This morning, we're going to be kicking off a new sermon series, a four-part sermon series on the Book of Ruth. And this is something that I'm really looking forward to, very, very, very much looking forward to. Just over the last couple of months, because of the way my Bible reading plan rolled out, I actually started at the very start of the Old Testament, have been working my way through. So I've just covered off Ruth, and it's such a juxtaposition, to use an unnecessarily large word. It's such a strange place for this little 4-chapter book to sit in between, coming straight after the Book of Judges, which, as you'll remember, we covered it a couple of years ago now in an almost infamous series of sermons, because the whole the Book of Judges is just so chaotic, violent, bloody, and disappointing. And that deals with the nation of Israel as a whole. It deals with judges, official people, important people. And then you have Ruth, and then you have 1 Samuel. And again, 1 Samuel has its share of bloodshed and is concerned with people who are kings, rulers, prophets, important people. And then sandwiched in between, you've got this little 4-chapter book that just looks at the common folk, if you like. So a really good reminder that in amongst national affairs and governing what happens to nations as a whole, this large scale, God is so interested in what happens to the lives of regular, if you like, everyday folk and people. And he's not only interested, but he's so concerned and his power is so great that he takes those affairs and he weaves them into what can happen to a nation as a whole, and in fact his universal plan of salvation. Amazing. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Kate's got to say about this little book. So on that, I'm going to read now the chapter that she's going to be covering off today, which is Ruth chapter 1. So if you've got your Bibles with you, please open them, or you can follow along on the screen. So this is from the ESV version. So this is the entire passage that Kate's going to be looking at. And after that, I'll lead us together in prayer. So Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me." So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to Margate Christian Church. Hang on one second. My name is Kate, and I'm starting this series on Ruth. So today I'm covering the first chapter, which Matt kindly read out and is conveniently just along the top row. So Ruth is a short book in the Old Testament, which comes in after the Book of Judges. The commentary that I've used quite a lot for this talk puts it well. After the Book of Judges, the Book of Ruth offers welcome relief. Judges had developed the theme of Israel's increasing spiritual disobedience with repeated brutal consequences, including chaos, bloodshed, violence, and deaths, lots of deaths. It's heavy. And in contrast, this book highlights the presence and nature of genuine spirituality in the same period. All the personalities in Ruth display authentic faith. The Book of Ruth demonstrates that the light of God's grace and human integrity still shine in the small rural community of Bethlehem, and indeed will continue to, as we well know that we revisit that town many years later. The commentary goes on. The Book of Ruth is one of the most delightful literary compositions of the ancient world. The narrator is a master at painting word pictures. There are many techniques to notice, from repetition, word plays, and more. I'll highlight a couple as we go. And they appeal to me, I think, in highlighting what a crafted work this book is. So the structure is a little bit like a short play or story with 4 main acts and a genealogy at the conclusion. Each act is set in its own time and place, but together they contribute to the artful presentation of the narrator's central themes, which is the hand of God in continuing Israel's royal line during the dark days of the Judges. It's quite a masterpiece with regard to word arrangement, portrayal of the depth of relationships and theology for such a short book, but there really isn't much time spent in the setting, travel, or lots of other details. As we will see, crucial details such as the famine and multiple deaths are dealt with really quite swiftly. We have little idea about life in Moab, let alone the challenges of travelling in a time of famine with small children. But it's worth mentioning the purpose of this style of story is not simply about the order of events. While it's thought to be historical, it's not about the sequence of events or even about what life is like. Instead, it is about the author's interpretation of these events. This is understanding their causes, their nature, and their consequences. And this has to be deduced from the telling, from the words of the narrator, and from the speech of the characters. In fact, the book is very speech-heavy. 52.5% of the book is speech by words, although I didn't actually count it while trying to work this out. That was in the commentary as well. So let's chat a little more about the actual story. And then I'll talk more about one of the themes in the book and what we can learn. Of course, many of the chapters are going to bring the same themes again and again as we work through, as we take quite a detailed look with 1 week for each chapter. So, considering the book as a play, we begin with Act 1, Scene 1, setting the stage for the location, the introduction of the main characters, and the situation that brings them together. So the story begins in the time of Judges, when there was a famine in the land of Bethlehem in Judea. The man, along with his wife and 2 sons, are off to Moab to escape the famine. So this generic introduction invites the reader to understand the problem of famine for the whole population. Come the next verse, they have names. Elimelech and his family, his wife Naomi and his sons Mahlon and Chilion. They go to sojourn in the field of Moab, to live for a while and wait it out. It suggested that the whole plan was Elimelech's, and the family tagged along. They're very much mentioned secondarily. The narrator doesn't tell us how to interpret the move. Was it an act of faith or unbelief? But anyone who is aware of the significance of famine in Israelite theology and how the relationship of Israel and Moab is, they will immediately wonder how things will turn out. If you aren't, I'll come back to the famine theology in a bit. But in terms of what it was like, I suspect much like famines anywhere right now. I had a conversation with a Red Cross door knocker this week. In fact, he was a tall Rwandan man who had actually grown up in a refugee camp in Ethiopia, which I think added quite a bit to the conversation. So he asked, expecting me to be wrong, but what was the number one biggest cause of child mortality now? In fact, it's still malnutrition. So back in Judea, without the protection of the UN Food Bank and the little packets of plumpy nut sachets with peanut butter and milk formula, I suspect that the children would have been dying. It would have been dire. So and this guy during the week showed me the little arm measurers with the little red zone, orange zone, green zone. They're really small. Holding it up next to Lewis, it's like, he's a very healthy child. So I think, famine, it's pretty scary. As for the Moabites, there are quite a number of reasons that they are unpopular. From their unpleasant beginnings from the relationship of Lot and his daughter, Israel's constitution exclusion of Moab from the assembly of God, and from the oppression of Israel by the Moabite king Eglon. He sounds evil. These factors and more would all be in the minds of readers watching the story of Ruth play out, and making it all the more incredible that they went there and that the story came to such a fruitful ending. Elimelech's name means something like, "My God is king." But in divergence to that, his departure from Bethlehem for Moab may have reflected his doubts about his God, and portray him designing his own solution instead of calling on God for mercy and repenting on the sins that plagued the whole nation. But I can imagine why staying put didn't feel like a good idea for the individual and family perspective. Although the famine was a punishment for the nation's lack of faith, what was he to do? And we don't know who else left for other places or how they survived. Scene 2 brings in some drama. We have the first the narrative description of the deaths of the three men, Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, and then later in scene 4, we come to Naomi's theological interpretation of these, and she reflects in her big speech. So first, Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi a widow and the boys fatherless. She is said to be left over, a term which is often used to speak of the bereavement of the death of another, but in particular those who have survived the wrath and judgment of God. On top of that, for Elimelech to be buried in the unclean foreign land of Moab is considered the ultimate punishment. So Naomi might be starting to rethink the wisdom of their move to Moab. And then the boys, now men, take wives. For one verse, there is hope that the line of Naomi and Elimelech might continue. This brief hope rests on the shoulders, or really actually the wombs, of these new characters we meet, Ruth and Orpah. Now, a side anecdote for you. So, while preparing this, I checked with a very good friend named Ruth. Having been called Ruth all her life, I thought she might have some useful insights. During our conversation, I gently teased her she was lucky that her parents hadn't chosen Orpah for her name. But there is someone who was given that name. And although I'll never catch up to Matt and his movie culture references, a light-hearted anecdote for you. So Oprah herself explains the origin of her name. So on her birth certificate, it is Orpah, but it got translated to Oprah because no one could say it. So here we are. And she says, "That's great because Oprah spells Harpo backwards. I don't know what Orpah spells." Well, it spells Hapro, which doesn't sound nearly as nice as Harpo, which is both her production company and her on-screen husband in the movie The Colour of Purple, 1985. So now you can think of Oprah when you read Ruth. Back to it. So the men each marry a Moabitess. The narrator tells us very little about this, except that the word is slightly unusual compared to the usual word for marry, and this one is sort of to lift or carry a woman. And in this case, it is likely referring to the illegitimate marriage with non-Israelites. So Moses had commanded the Israelites not to marry a whole list of pagan nations, and while the Moabites were not specifically excluded with their foreign god Chemosh, they would have been in effect pagans as well. So as the new head of the household, possibly Naomi should have prevented these marriages, although I'm sure she also hoped for grandchildren. So both sons were married for 10 years and bore no children, and then the brothers died. Their inability to have children must be taken here as the hidden hand of God, so not blessing their marriage. Similarly, in reverse, later on, when, spoiler alert, Ruth conceives a son to Boaz, this must also be seen as an act of God. So scene 3. This describes the response of Naomi and her daughters-in-law to the crisis they now find themselves in. No husbands or sons, and thus no hope for their future. These two facts are so tightly entwined in this time. The options for widows were very few. The discussion that follows can be quite neatly divided into 3 parts, again showing the careful crafting of language and the resulting symbolism. So after Naomi hears there is food in Bethlehem, she sets out with both her daughters-in-law on the journey home. On this journey, they have a series of conversations, and through these, Ruth and Orpah are differentiated, and Ruth emerges as a courageous and noble character of her own right. Naomi begins to accept her daughter-in-law as part of her life, and Orpah, in turn, returns to her own lands, and in Naomi's own words, her gods. So let's have a look. So exchange 1, we have Naomi versus Orpah and Ruth, who we yet don't know anything different about. So the verses I'll read. So Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." And for extra effect, verse 8 has a doubled command and double blessing. Naomi says, "Go back and return," which is then paired up, as we see many times in this book, with 2 blessings. So may the Lord show you kindness, and may the Lord grant each of you find rest in the house of another husband. There's so much of this construction. So this is Naomi, separate from the as yet 2 indistinguishable daughters-in-law. Exchange 2. Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight, and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than you, because the Lord's hand is turned against me." At this they wept aloud. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. All the pictures had these very droopy women. I tried to find other ones, but in the end I thought the symbolism is just too good. And then exchange 3. So the dynamic has changed. Orpah is heading back, and Naomi and Ruth are beginning to form this new bond. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. And then in scene 4, we have the interpretation of the crisis. So fast forward the rest of the journey, and Naomi has returned with Ruth to Bethlehem. We have a new setting for this scene and new characters, the townsfolk. They start the conversation, but then it's pretty much Naomi for the rest, having the final word of this act. Their appearance in Bethlehem has caused a stir, the townsfolk wondering, could this be Naomi? They're surprised perhaps that she has come. But also, after all the years, the grief and the deprivation have surely taken their toll on Naomi, and it would have shown. This one who has left Bethlehem as Naomi, the pleasant one, has returned a robust woman in her prime, has returned a haggard and destitute old woman. This fact is not lost on Naomi. Overhearing the question that is circulating among the women, she interrupts the buzz with a retort. So she gives public vent to her years of frustration and pain, and she demands a new name. She may have left Bethlehem as Naomi, but she has returned as a different person. From now on, she says, they must call her Mara. With this, we glimpse the depth of her bitterness. So she levels 4 accusations against God. Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me, and the Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So once again, there's careful symmetry to the arrangement of Naomi's words. Empty and full are contrasted, and there is actually an A-B-B-A pattern of Almighty Lord, Lord Almighty. So carefully done. So clearly she didn't go away from Bethlehem full of food and happiness. She had left in a famine to save their lives. However, the fullness she refers to is different. When she left, she had a husband and 2 sons, and I guess a full future possibility. On her return, although less hungry, she is empty. A widow, no children or grandchildren to continue the family. This theme of importance of children, and in particular carrying on the family, is so central to the Book of Ruth. In verse 21, she blames her present miserable state on God, Yahweh. He has testified against her. So after such a speech of faith and dedication from Ruth just a moment ago, Naomi's vent is a bit of a downer, really. At the end of Act 1, and virtually chapter 1, this is where we are. So all that remains is the final verse, which is basically the start of Act 2 and a recap of where we've come to. Come to that. So Ruth and Naomi's final speeches are very much in contrast. As the readers, we're left with many questions. We have no idea about how Ruth is feeling with her decision to follow Naomi to this land and to follow her to her God, who Naomi has just accused of being the cause of all her misery. But we'll hear more about that in the weeks to come. And again, another spoiler alert. Although Naomi is the one who's returned empty, in the fullness of time it will be Ruth whose life is filled first, with food, a husband, and a son. Although it hasn't yet transpired, this theme of the book works through from emptiness to fullness. Naomi adds depth and meaning to this theme when she blames God for emptying her life and making her bitter. In the weeks to come, we will see the narrator, who almost never overtly mentions God, will give specific recognition that it is with divine involvement that Ruth does conceive a son. So one final theme to touch on is this word hesed, which in the original, I'm told, pops up again and again, and it certainly comes through a lot in this commentary. So it's a word that tells us both about God and about what we hope for in the lives of people of God. So the Hebrew word doesn't clearly translate to a single English word that can capture the depth of meaning, but often kindness or loving kindness is what we see. It's a strong relational term that ties together all of the positive attributes of God: love, mercy, kindness, goodness, benevolence, loyalty, covenant faithfulness. So in short, the quality that moves a person to act for the benefit of another without respect to the advantage it might bring the one who expresses it. So the quality that moves a person to act for the benefit of another without respect to what it might bring to the person who expresses it. So hesed is the word that sums up the covenant between God and his people. So God shows loving kindness to his people and expects them to show it in return. It's striking that no one in the book prays for a resolution to their own crisis. In each case, a person prays that Yahweh or God would bless someone else. So this is a mark of hesed. Naomi uses the word in her prayer to her Moabite daughters-in-law, showing a confidence that the God of Israel will show kindness to those outside his covenant. So they were told not to go there, they were told not to marry them, and yet she prays for them. In fact, this is a powerful reminder to us in how we view people who are other to us, from other places and not yet part of God's family. But the characters also express hesed in practical, more tangible ways. So like Abraham's excursion to Egypt, the family's move to Moab to escape the famine looks like a lapse of spiritual commitment. Instead of dealing with the root causes, so repenting, they reacted to the symptoms, although we see why. Instead of recognizing the famine to be the punishment for the nation's sin and repenting of their spiritual infidelity, they left their people and their land for the unclean land of Moab. It seems, however, that once the men in this family have been removed, somewhat through further acts of judgment, and all her economic props have been removed, Naomi comes to her senses. Hearing that Yahweh had intervened on behalf of his people, ending the famine, it is with faith that she returns to Bethlehem. After this, she expresses Hesed practically in many ways. So she addresses her Moabite daughters-in-law fondly as my daughters. She tries to spare them her own distress by sending them home to their mothers' homes. And then finally, she allows Ruth to convince her to let her go back with her to Bethlehem. And that's just for chapter 1. As we go through the rest of Ruth in the following weeks, we'll see the narrator is describing for us what a life of faith should look like. We'll find the measure of a people or a person's faith is not found in the miracles that one can wrest from the hand of God, nor in one's personal health or prosperity, but in demonstrating an ethical character. We find that genuine piety is expressed primarily in devotion, sensitivity, grace, and kindness toward others, and the openness to the working of God. This may be totally unspectacular, but rather expressed by the quiet and loving actions that promote the next person's well-being and verbal expressions of prayer for the next person. And we find that the grace of God knows no boundaries. Even a despised, at least by people, Moabitess is incorporated into the nation of Israel, accepted into the community, and as we will see, incorporated into the line that will bring us Jesus. This may be both a reminder that people can stuff it up with their bad decisions or rejection of God, and yet God in his grace can incorporates them into his larger plan, and also of God's desire to extend his love beyond Israel. We know that Jesus comes for Jews and Gentiles alike and openly shares God's grace for all. God's grace really does have no boundaries. We're getting ahead of ourselves to look to the future in both this book and the New Testament, but because we all know where it ends, we can now remember the connection of Jesus to this book of Ruth. 500 years later, the New Testament opens with another young woman displaying all the marks of Hesed, and who has found favour with God. She too would bear a son, but this son would be greater than Ruth's child or even her grandchild. His name would be Jesus, and he would be called the Son of the Most High. And he was born that he may lay down his life in order to bring life to us. And that is what we remember each week, but in particular at Easter next week. I'm going to pray. Dear God, may we enjoy the normalness of the people of Ruth. Some challenges, but their aspiration and their success in the marks of Hesed, their kindness and their grace that you show to them. May we learn from this and be encouraged, and as we aspire for normal, unspectacular, but loving lives. Amen.